historic Flatbush here in central Brooklyn. I'm going to be giving you a look at the type of tours we offer, but obviously in a different format in this time of quarantine. So you are looking toward Flatbush Avenue here, and there's Church Avenue to your left. The building you see with the sort of towers on the other side of Flatbush Avenue is historic Erasmus Hall High School, the alma mater of Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand and others. That building dates back to the early 20th century, but the school grounds itself actually date back to the late 18th century. It's one of the oldest such secondary schools in New York City. But here you are looking actually directly at the churchyard of the Dutch Reformed Protestant Church of Flatbush. The building you see there in the background, that beautiful schist building, that was constructed in the 1790s, just shortly after the birth of our nation. But the churchyard itself and the grounds of the church actually date back to 1654. You are looking at one of the oldest cemeteries in all of New York City. So for those of you who know your really deep dive New York City history, you know that before we were New York, there was a colony in Lower Manhattan called New Amsterdam, and a larger colony surrounding it known as New Netherland. And here was the independent town of Flatbush, founded in 1654 by Peter Stuyvesant himself, with much of the land that is now Flatbush granted to the church by Stuyvesant himself. And this beautiful historic remnant remains here in Flatbush today. So as we're going to walk through this section of Flatbush, we're going to see how the neighborhood has evolved, and we'll see a couple of small historic districts and medium-sized historic districts of beautiful turn-of-the-century residential life here in central Brooklyn. But one reason I love to do tours here in Flatbush, I believe this neighborhood is the long and deep history of Brooklyn in microcosm, dating back to the Dutch colonial days. You know, you're looking at gravestones in some cases that predate the United States of America, which is really sort of hard to grasp, but it's just really tremendous. And a church which was built 1 year after George Washington's inauguration. So a lot of deep history, and then how it evolved, starting in the, farmland in the 1700s, and then a residential growth in the late 1800s through the sort of growth of immigrant communities throughout the 20th century. And that's what we'll explore as we make our way along here. So we are here on East 21st Street. Again, we are just one block west of Flatbush Avenue. And it's hard to imagine, if you've ever walked down Flatbush Avenue, particularly in this section of the neighborhood, you're very familiar with it as a bustling, busy commercial zone. Unfortunately, on a day like today, still too busy for us to head over there, but just really bustling. And then you come just one block over, and again, you've got remnants of New Netherlands in the Dutch colonial era over here. This church would be familiar to anyone who viewed the Hulu TV series The Path, starring Breaking Bad's Aaron Paul. In it, he's the leader of a sort of religious cult. In one of the seasons, their sort of compound was actually filmed here. So here, looking straight ahead, this is actually the parsonage of the church. It's a beautiful old building that can frankly use a little bit of love. But we're just coming up on one of the smallest historic districts in Brooklyn, and the smallest historic district of what largely makes up what is known as Victorian Flatbush. These beautiful turn-of-the-century, very stately residential districts. So this is known as the Albemarle and Kenmare Terraces Historic District, because the entire district just consists of two streets, Kenmare Terrace, which we are here, the next one over. Now this is a unique street because half of the street belongs to the church property, including the parsonage and that building just beyond there, which was built in the early 20th century as a sort of community house for the church. And these beautiful homes here, which date back roughly to about 1915 to 1916. You can see some also holdout homes here on the street. Now this side of the street gives you an idea of how, starting in the 1930s, this neighborhood was largely rebuilt by developers, began buying up some of these older, more larger plots, tearing them down to build denser housing in some of these apartment buildings that you see here. So it's very sort of unique, as you have this, other than a couple of small homes that are still here on the west side of East 21st Street, pretty much everything on that side of the street was largely torn down or replaced with apartment buildings throughout the 1930s and 1940s. There's some beautiful, actually, design work on some of these buildings here. Now, here is Albemarle Terrace. For those of you who know, you can always tell you are in a historic district when you look up at the street sign. You see these sort of brown terracotta colored street signs. So this street I really love because it actually reminds me more of maybe Back Bay in Boston or some of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. But again, these beautiful, beautiful 1915 to 1916 homes. It's not something that, again, you would expect to find just one block west of bustling commercial Flatbush Avenue, but here it is. We're going to keep walking down East 21st Street and we'll eventually make our way to the Prospect Park South Historic District, which was the first historic district in what is largely known as Victorian Flatbush. So many people may be not familiar with Prospect Park South or with the term Victorian Flatbush, but I would bet most people in New York have heard the neighborhood Ditmas Park. Ditmas Park is just south of here, and it's probably the most famous of the districts here in what is collectively known as Victorian Flatbush. So in addition to Ditmas Park, Prospect Park South, Albemarle Kenmare Terraces, there's also the Beverly Square East and West sections, which we'll see, which have not yet been declared historic district, but there's also the Midwood Fisk Terrace Historic District, which is just sort of south of Newkirk Plaza and north of Brooklyn College. So this neighborhood has obviously changed a lot since its apartment residential growth in the 1930s and 40s. Now, for a good chunk of the 20th century, this was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, particularly this section of Flatbush. And then obviously, as any neighborhood of Brooklyn continued to change and evolve, today it is a predominantly Black neighborhood, particularly filled with immigrants from the Caribbean nations, Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad, and other places. But you can see a lot of remnants, besides a number of beautiful, still operational synagogues throughout Flatbush. You have buildings like this, which today is a missionary Baptist church. But if you look at the railings there and some of the sort of remnants on the building, you could tell that this was once a synagogue and not a Baptist church. So we are here on Albemarle Road. Now, Albemarle Road is actually a great example of how, starting in the late 19th century, how this section of Flatbush was really replanned to be something very, very stately and very, very grand. So just north of here is Church Avenue. That's just north of the church grounds. In fact, the church that we saw there, the old Dutch Reformed Protestant church, is the church, the original church that gives Church Avenue its name. And originally, as the city was planning out the grids of Flatbush, below Church Avenue, you were going to have Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, D, etc. But as these developers began buying up this land at the end of the 19th century, they didn't want to sell land on Avenue A, Avenue B, etc. They wanted them to have statelier names, like this street here, which is Ocean Avenue, because it leads down to the ocean. So once they began developing these lands, they were able to get the streets renamed, but using their original letters. So Avenue A becomes Albemarle Road, Avenue B becomes Beverly Road, C becomes Cortelyou Road, D becomes Dorchester. E, for some reason, doesn't get a name. That just becomes Ditmas Avenue. But then you have Foster Avenue, and then so on and so on, before eventually you get down to Avenue H, where the letters just sort of take back over there. So if you ever look at the map of this section of Brooklyn, you'll notice that many of the street names do go in alphabetical order here. That is not a coincidence. That was due to part of this unique planning at the end of that century. If you look in the distance, Albemarle Road in this section actually dead ends at the sort of below grade subway tracks of the, today, what is the B and the Q lines, the old BMT system Brighton Beach lines. Now, those lines themselves actually predate the New York City subway system. Originally, the lines that sort of crossed through this section of Flatbush were part of the Brighton Beach and Coney Island Railroad, a private railway system that was developed in the sort of late 19th century to bring people to sort of the northern parts of Brooklyn down to Brighton Beach and Coney Island and to the sort of beach resorts and things down there. Now, the original cut of that railway sort of went from Fulton Street and all the way down to Brighton Beach and Coney Island. Once that was taken over by the New York City subway system and rebuilt as the line we know it as today, the BMT extended the line north of Prospect Park. Again, that continues on today as the lines we know as the B and the Q. And then the original cut of the section where it would cut from Prospect Park, that was turned into the Franklin Avenue shuttle. So that section still remains as well today. But just there where the street dead ends, just sort of beneath that fence, is the subway lines over there. Now, there used to actually be a pedestrian bridge right at that dead end, which would allow people to cross over the tracks here at Albemarle Road. Based on my research, I discovered that that was torn down in the late 1970s, around 1979, as best I was able to discover, because that side of the neighborhood is where the historic district is that we're making our way toward. This side of the neighborhood, again, you can see is not a historic district. These are all these 30s and 40s apartment buildings over here and not as well preserved. And the wealthier people on the other side of the tracks wanted to isolate themselves, and so they were able to get that bridge removed. That is obviously unfortunate for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that if you are walking today from one end of the neighborhood to the other, rather than just walking down Albemarle Road and crossing that beautiful old pedestrian bridge, you do sort of have to go out of your way like this to get around. But that, again, was the intention of the wealthier residents of that area. So right now we are on East 19th Street and we are making our way toward Beverly Road. So on the southern side of Beverly Road, which we're coming up on here, is the first historic district that was developed at the end of the 19th century. So there were a number of competing developers in this era who were building these developments. The primary one that we'll be talking about as we get over to that section shortly is Dean Albert, who is responsible for developing the section that became Prospect Park South. Now there you see Beverly Road. Here's some of these apartment buildings. So once you get to the south side of Beverly Road, the developer who had purchased that land was a man named T.B. Ackerson, Thomas Benton Ackerson. And all of this land that we're walking through right now, at the time, was rural. This was countryside. This was all farmland. Hard to imagine today when you're walking through neighborhoods like this in Brooklyn that this was all once farmland, but that's the way it was when people like Dean Albert and T.B. Ackerson first came here. So they bought all of this rural land and began developing it. Now, to our left on the other side of Beverly Road were the developments that T.B. Ackerson made, which he called the Beverly Squares. And for some reason, it was divided up into sort of two separate districts. There was Beverly Square East and Beverly Square West. We are in the east section right now. And some of the first homes were being built there throughout the 1890s, with most of the earlier homes dating back to 1898, 1899, right at the turn of the century there. Now there is this weird thing where that section of the neighborhood, the Beverly Square section, is today not a historic district, despite containing some of the oldest homes in this area. If you go, again, where we're headed, Prospect Park South, that is a historic district. You go literally just about a block and a half west of the Beverly Square section, you hit the Ditmas Park Historic District, which again is a historic district. And yet here in the middle, you have Beverly Square, which is not. The neighborhood residents have been working and fighting to get the Landmark Preservation Commission to designate it a historic district for basically about a decade now, but to no luck. And their concern is obviously it not being a historic district. There's nothing stopping developers from just buying up properties and sort of tearing them down and replacing them, which really has not happened that much, but that's their concern, for better or worse. So here you can see to your left on the other side of Beverly Road is the Beverly Road subway station. Now this dates back to the early 20th century and really is kind of unique because, again, this was built back when this was still private railways over here, and is identical to the one literally just one block south of us at Cortelyou Road. Fun piece of New York City trivia, it is the shortest distance between any two stations in the New York City subway system today, one block apart, Beverly Road and Cortelyou Road. But they were sort of built that close because they had these competing sort of different developments here. Again, T.B. Ackerson's Beverly Square West here, Dean Albert's Prospect Park South, and then there was the sort of separate Ditmas Park District, which was done by a man named Lewis Pounds. So today, the subway tracks, which were sort of right on top of here on Beverly Road, basically mark the dividing line between the part of the neighborhood that's been mostly redeveloped and the historic district. It's literally an other side of the tracks kind of separation here. So if you can sort of see in the distance that sign that says Marlborough Road, you'll notice again that's another terracotta sign. So we're about to enter another historic district, Prospect Park South. You can see these beautiful brick and stone pillars on the corner. This is part of Dean Albert's design for it. And you can see PSP, Prospect Park South, Beverly Road, and Marlborough Road over here. And then again, some of these beautiful homes of the Beverly Square section on the other side. But we are here on Marlborough Road in beautiful historic Prospect Park South. This was given landmark designation in 1979 by the Landmark Preservation Commission. And today, very, very high prices. Right at the end, before we wrap up, I will show you a home that just went on the market for $3.9 million. So when Dean Albert began planning out this community in the 1890s, really his goal was to create what he called the village in the city. At the time, the majority of Brooklyn neighborhoods were sort of all brownstones. I mean, if you think about the majority of your historic neighborhoods throughout Brooklyn in the 20th century, whether it's Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, good chunks of Williamsburg, certainly Brooklyn Heights and Fort Greene, they really, in a lot of ways, look the same. They're all these beautiful, admittedly, row houses, these beautiful brownstones. But much of Brooklyn, residential Brooklyn, did look the same in this era. And what Albert and others wanted to do was to break that mold. And really, in a lot of ways, created the blueprint for what would become the modern American suburb. Now, while this is collectively all known as Victorian Flatbush, there are many different architectural styles found throughout the historic district. not just beautiful Victorian homes, but you have Queen Anne style homes, sort of Swiss chalet style homes, beautiful sort of Tudor homes, and many other types of designs throughout the area. Most of the homes here in Prospect Park South date between 1899 through about 1905 or so. At the corner there, you see a beautiful white home that was very recently restored by actress Michelle Williams, who purchased it several years ago when it was frankly in a very dilapidated state. She poured a lot of money into it, lived here for several years, and I believe she has just recently sold it to a friend of hers who is a playwright or author. I forget the name, but did a beautiful job here on the home. And so earlier we were walking on Albemarle Road. We are back here on Albemarle Road, but obviously a very different section. So again, there's the train tracks. We saw the other area where it dead ended, that removal of the bridge in the late 70s, making it impossible to directly go from one end to the other. But Albemarle Road is really the centerpiece of Dean Alvord's design and district. You have these beautiful malls down the middle of the road here, providing a lot of lush greenery. Now, one reason why Dean Alvord and others picked this specific part of Brooklyn for their unique suburban style development is just a couple of blocks north of here is Prospect Park. Again, we are here in Prospect Park South, so that makes sense. So when Prospect Park was created by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux in the late 19th century, really obviously became very popular and a great spot in Brooklyn, and much like Central Park attracted residential growth around it in that era, so did Prospect Park. People wanted to live near here, and again, this was the neighborhood that developers like Dean Alvord built for those people. I want to point out a kind of couple of relics that are over here in front of what the neighborhood residents just call the Michelle Williams house. You have this old stone marker here. This is where the postal boxes would have been back in the day. You've got this very old street sign here, rusting away here on the corner of Albemarle Road in Marlborough. So beautiful street. Now we're gonna make our way over to what is probably the most photogenic block in the area, which is Buckingham Road. So again, on the other side of the street where we were, we were on East 21st Street, then East 19th Street. So those all have the numbers in the same way that avenues A, B, and C, again, were renamed here. So were the numbered streets. So rather than having sort of East 17th Street and others, you would have Buckingham Road, Marlborough Road, Rugby Road, Argyle Road, Stratford, and others, to give again this a really sort of British stately feeling, to really let you know that you were in something high class. You can hear the subway rolling on in the distance there. So we've come up here on Buckingham Road. And it's springtime now, so you can see all the beautiful sort of flowery blooms throughout the neighborhood here. It's quite gorgeous right now to actually walk through the neighborhood and take a safe social distance walk. Now we're about to pass one of the most famous homes in Victorian Flatbush, which is the early 20th century Japanese house. So the turn of the century at that time was right around the age that sort of Japanese culture and Japanese sort of style became very popular in the United States. Geisha girls and the like, and that kind of beautiful style. So what Dean Alvord wanted was a sort of beautiful home that he could put on postcards, and he could really make a sort of marquee for the neighborhood and use in advertisements to sell how unique this area was. So he hired a bunch of artisans from Japan and brought them here to help build this house that was designed by architect John Pettit, but again with consultation from actual artisans from Japan to sort of get the style right. The current owner of the home has lived here for several decades, and she has done a really good job of sort of maintaining the home. And just kind of these really unique color scheme that her and her late husband had given to the home when they first moved in. Beautiful spring blooms here, looking at the Flatbush malls. The owner of the Japanese house, as it's known, does occasionally give tours, obviously paid tours, where she will bring people into her home, talk about the history of it, and sort of show people her unique sort of home decor and art collections. It's actually kind of fascinating. This is a 1940 apartment building that was obviously built here prior to the landmarking that replaced one of the older homes that would have been here. It's known as the Buckingham. Some gorgeous homes over here. So when I do this tour, I usually do it as a much longer tour, about 2 hours. We go over to Flatbush Avenue. We take a look at Erasmus Hall. We take a look at the historic King's Theater, formerly the Lowe's King's Theater. We talk about a little bit of the deeper history of the neighborhood, but just giving you sort of a half-hour version and a taste of what I think makes this section of Flatbush so unique. So literally, in just the time that we've been doing this tour, we went from remnants of Dutch colonial era, a Flatbush Dutch Reformed church dating back to the, colonial era of this country, and now we are here in this beautiful historic district. I mean, you wouldn't imagine that you could just walk through so many centuries of history within a fairly short distance. So this beautiful home here just actually went on the market. You can find an article about it on Curbed. It is currently listed for about $3.9 million. These homes are huge. They've got, tons of bedrooms and bathrooms and parlors, massive kitchens, and all this great amenities that it talks about. Beautiful back garden, which obviously we can't see from here. One thing I would point out is if you look at both the actual listing as well as the Curbed article sort of selling this home, you're not going to see mention of the fact that sort of right behind this home is the subway tracks. I live in an apartment building on another side of the subway tracks, and I can actually confirm that after basically living there for about a week, it just becomes white noise and your brain doesn't even notice anymore. But just thought it was funny that $4 million and they're not going to mention that you will be neighboring with subway tracks. There is Church Avenue over there, bustling and commercial, and then here just on this side, again, very sort of peaceful and quiet, with some beautiful, gorgeous sort of Tudor style homes over here. So this is Prospect Park South here in Victorian Flatbush. Once it is safe to do so again, really look forward to giving people this tour and many others, and really show people sort of unique slices of the city, and to get people to think about the sort of multifaceted face of Brooklyn. So thank you for tuning in. I hope this has been sort of an interesting half-hour walk with me here in Flatbush this morning, and hopefully we will all see you soon. Keep washing your hands and stay safe. Take care.